While this is still going to be a mess of a video, excluding Act 2 here is going to make it much more digestible. Making this video only about Act 1 allows me to not only make it spoiler free, it also solves a lot of confusion when Act 2 adds so many new abilities and entirely changes the way some characters perform. While I will mention random battles in passing, I am mostly focusing on bosses, since the solution for random battles that pose a problem is to just not fight them. Beyond skipping them, you can also cheese basically every random encounter with status effect spam. If I had to give general advice, it would be to not overvalue AoE options, since taking away one of the enemies immediately also means that you won't be facing their attack. On the same note, status effects are really strong. The buyable consumables like Coagulant really do a lot of work, and if you do find a situation where it helps you, you might as well apply it, even if it seems wasted on a random battle, because at the end of the day you do get more gold from winning a battle than one Coagulant costs, and the money in this game really isn't tight if you're selling your old equipment. Another piece of general advice is that this isn't a recommendation for who to use in a core team. Which party members you have in your active lineup should constantly be switching, depending on the situation. Whenever a party member gets put to sleep or dies, it's easier to swap them out instead of trying to cure them immediately. It is always possible to swap them back in on an action where you actually have the chance to cure them. But there's really countless situations. Even if I'm going to rag on Erik for being bad later, there's still plenty of situations where an enemy is asleep, so you can swap him in at the end of a turn and he can use Victimizer before the enemy gets to act and has a chance to wake up. You should constantly be thinking about all your party members and who's best suited to the situation, and I hope this guide is going to make it more clear in what situations what party members excel. Another thing I hope to clarify is the skill trees and when you should reallocate which parts of your skill tree. You can reallocate your skills basically for free and as many times as you want. You unlock the ability to do so extremely early on, right after the Jarvis boss fight, so do recommend reallocating your skills depending on the situation. So depending on where in the game you are, what your level is at, how many skill points you have available, and of course what bosses you're getting stuck on, changing up your skills. Therefore also your equipment is something you should do as often as you can, as long as you get even a small benefit from it. And with that out of the way, it's finally time to talk about the first character. The luminary, or main character, whatever I am calling him here, is first. While he technically has 3 paths to go down, I think he's the simplest character to build in Act 1. The most interesting part about him is before you can reallocate. This is the one point in the game where regular swords outshine great swords. Flame Slash has a small flat damage bonus of maybe 5 points, but it's enough to make it outdamage great swords despite them having higher attack. Then right before you get the ability to reallocate, the final boss is Jarvis, a dragon who is weak to Dragon Slash. Dragon Slash is going to only do about the same damage as Cutting Edge at this point of the game. But with Flame Slash being stronger early on with the ability to wield shields alongside your sword, I think it's fair to say that they outperform great swords early on. From this point onwards, the best single target damage is always going to be Cutting Edge and eventually Unbridled Blade once you get it. That's mostly because there's a huge attack gap between regular swords and great swords. So even Falcon Slash, which technically has the same 2x multiplier, deals much less damage than Cutting Edge because 1x damage with great swords is so much higher than 1x damage with normal swords. Even when you eventually get the ability to dual wield, Falcon Slash will not even outdamage Cutting Edge. That's at the point of the game where you have Unbridled Blade, which has a 3x multiplier. Getting an extra hit sounds neat in theory, but it only uses a fraction of your strength to calculate the damage, which often leaves it dealing very small amounts. At this point you have a 3x multiplier on greatswords with Unbridled Blade though, which is much stronger than a theoretical Falcon Slash where the offhand weapons hit had a 1x multiplier. The Falcon Blade weapon is technically the best option without an MP cost, but you're never going to run out of MP in this game. And it really doesn't matter what buffs or debuffs are applied, because greatswords are always going to outdamage swords. Swords only have one thing, and that's Giga Slash. It comes into play in at most 2 boss fights, Tentacular and the Elysium Bird. It can technically be used for either of those fights, and if you want to use it, you can simply reallocate right back afterwards. There's 2 more fights where it technically comes into play, which are both at the start of Act 2, Tyrant and the Headless Honcho. The Headless Honcho is barely a fight and not really worth talking about. But for Tyrant specifically, he has a parry chance, so Giga Slash circumvents that. There's a regular sword available to you that has a damage multiplier against him, which is going to be applied when you're using Giga Slash. And he's also weak to lightning, and his defense is pretty high, and at that point in the game you have no way of reducing it. And coupled with the fact that he sometimes summons a second ally that isn't grouped in with him, Giga Slash actually becomes your best option in that fight. Though of course you will reallocate right back afterwards. It's also worth noting that Giga Slash, as well as all the splitter moves you get later on, only scale with your strength, not your damage, meaning you won't do 2 times your normal attack damage for something. So your weapon strength as well as the enemy's defense doesn't come into play. This means that reallocating over to swords is extremely easy and doesn't really require you to craft a weapon or anything. A literal stick will do the same amount of damage as the strongest weapon in the game. Then lastly you have the luminary skill tree, which has 2 notable skills. Zap basically has the same attributes as Giga Slash, but I don't recommend using it for any fight unless you're way over leveled against Green Griffins early on. If you got that early on, it's also good against the Ads and Jarvis fight. And against the Slayer of the Sands, the damage is higher than if you were to hit him without lowering his defense first. Especially if you increase his weakness to lightning by using Thunder and Lightning. So what I'm saying is that I never recommend going to the Luminary skill tree during Act 1. That's an ability called Pep Up, which is extremely strong, but it's also extremely late. If you get it during Act 1 at all, it's only going to be for the last few fights. And while it is extremely powerful, I'm not sure whether it's worth giving up all this damage for. So with that in mind, I'm making the assumption that you're only deciding between swords and great swords for now. In which case, there's one more benefit swords technically have over great swords, and that's the ability to wield a shield alongside them. Of course, you can't wield one if you're playing with the Draconian Quest No Armor. And while they're a nice bonus for your defensive stats, the block chance is not really better than the parry chance you get from great swords. And as we've talked about earlier, equipment switching is a thing, and you can always switch to a shield on turns where the luminary isn't directly using his great swords for an attack. So whenever you're using an item or healing, using a spell, or activating a pep, you can use a shield and reap the full benefits, because the luminary doesn't have a skill tree for his shields. The bottom line is the greatswords are going to be the best option for him in 90% of cases, and you should only use something else when the situation specifically calls for it. The hero is extremely flexible though, and while greatswords are his best damage option, he can do a lot more than just bonk a single target. For example, very early on you can use Metal Slash to hunt metal enemies, with which I mean regular metal slimes, because liquid metal slimes are much more easily dealt with a single critical, and Illuminate does actually have a good critical chance when he's pepped, which means that at that point you should either be using Sword Knives if you have it, which you probably won't, or Falcon Slash. After of course getting pepped up with the pep up ability. The Luminary can increase his parry chance with either a regular sword stance or greatsword stance, although only greatsword stance is ever useful. By itself, increasing parry chance when you already have a base parry chance is better than if you have a shield and a block chance, because you roll for block and then you roll for parry. So if you simply roll for a parry with a higher chance, it's going to have the best outcome. They still sound extremely shit by themselves because you can't parry most attacks, but the 3 points during Act 1, well technically 2.5, Greatsword Guard is one of the best things you have to nudge the odds in your favor. There's also a thing on your skill tree you can get that allows you to counter attacks that you parry, which translates to only the abilities that are single target, single hit, and that you happen to parry, which again is only useful in 3 cases: against Yermon, against the MMA fights, and against Tyrant. The last few relevant abilities are all on greatsword trees, and they all happen to target an enemy group. Group targeting isn't very good in this game, sadly. The best of the bunch is Heli Chopper, which is the only ability that targets multiple enemies and scales with the Luminary side attack power using greatswords. Although you don't even want to use this one very often, as killing a single enemy with Unbridled Blade will immediately take away one of the enemy's actions. Groups in this game also don't tend to get bigger than maybe 4. So as soon as you get Unbridled Blade, you will only be using that one, because even if they do the same amount of damage, spreading out your damage is worse than dealing high single target damage and taking out one of the threats immediately. The next one, Frost Fang, deals strength based damage, which is again only good if you're underleveled, but the level at which you get it without using skill seeds is so high that unless you are using skill seeds on the hero, which isn't the worst thing per se, it's probably not worth it. It has a unique property in the ability to sometimes stun an enemy, but sadly most bosses are immune to it. The fact that it deals ice damage is barely relevant. And lastly we have Giga Smash, which is a bad version of Giga Slash, because unlike Giga Slash it doesn't hit all enemies but only a group, and to make up for it does like 10% more damage. That might sound like it would be better than regular swords against a Tyrant fight, but unlike regular swords there's no great sword that's effective against him inherently, meaning Giga Slash outdamages it in single target damage. With that we can move on to his spells, and while he doesn't have many good ones, he has many. His healing spells are only really useful outside of combat until you eventually get more heal at level 30, because consumables heal more than the hero does for a good while, or at least the same amount without an MP cost attached to them. The only exception would be with the no shopping draconian quest, where they become much more useful. He sadly doesn't learn any good damage spells from levels, and just like with the healing item, Sleeping Hibiscus just outperforms Snooze at any point in the game, given how Snooze has a base chance of 50%, which doesn't compare well to the roughly 80% that Sleeping Hibiscus has. Lastly he has Zing, which is just bad if you've ever played these games. You can't rely on it, and even if you get it off during a boss fight, the HP that the party member comes back with is so low that they will just die immediately afterwards. And one thing that surprisingly affects the luminary a lot is whether you use the casino or not. It means that Zing outside of battle doesn't have any use because you can get infinite revives with Yggdrasil leaves, but it also means that you get the Platinum Power Sword, which makes great swords even more dominant than they already are. Furthermore, the hero is involved in almost all pep powers, which gives him the ability to activate most of them. It also makes him the bottleneck for activating them, which is again why pep up on him is actually a useful skill. If any other character had it, would be bad, except maybe Web. He also happens to be in the best spot for activating pep powers. Going middle of the pack is best because it allows you to swap the party members that already acted out for the ones that you want to be involved in the pep. And then you still have the very last action of the turn to swap in whoever you want on the next one. That's the optimal setup, and it makes going last or even going first awkward when you're activating peps. It's almost a shame because while the Luminary is the best one to activate peps, his actions are so valuable that you want someone else to activate them in the most cases. His damage is just really good, and it's so good actually that despite there being a high risk of him getting stunned, which prevents all peps from going off, which is devastating, or even if you're playing with the Draconian quest where you wipe out if he dies, you still don't want to bench this guy and not reap the benefits of his insane damage early on. In most playthroughs he's going to have the highest physical damage in your party until Jade joins, and even then, maybe if he gets some Wild Blade he has the highest damage. And especially if you went to the casino and got the Platinum Power Sword, he's going to outdamage everybody else. It's a no-brainer to buff his attack and go to town. Maybe even reduce enemy defense, but unlike the next guy, the hero's attack is so high that he can hit through enemy defense and still do good damage.
Fabulous! You're not gonna like this! This is it! Victimizer! Take it easy. Bye-bye!
Erik is definitely the most misunderstood character here. People either praise him as some demigod or they don't use him to his full potential at all. I'll cut to the chase. His performance in Act 1 is pretty bad. His attack is so low that without Zap to reduce enemy defense he sometimes fails to damage bosses at all. At the very start he's good, but that's only because you don't have any other options. There, Flame Slash and maybe even Dragon Slash, if you can get it before Jarvis, have some value. Early on, Erik also gets plus 10 attack from his sword skill tree. Plus 10 attack is more than 20% of your total attack, and coupled with Flame Slash and the flat damage bonus you get from that, swords for Erik not only outdamage all his other options, but it even allows him to outdamage the Luminary, given how the strength difference isn't quite as high. Sleeper hit and power throw are also valid options to go to before reallocation, but afterwards, despite his options opening up, he can't quite start doing damage. First, I'll get knives out of the way, and to do that I need to address the combo that people like to praise so much. So Erik has two moves, Burst Cutter and Victimize, that do 6 times the normal damage if an enemy has a certain status effect. Sometimes, for example on a sleeping enemy, you can get a big hit for free, which is especially useful because you sometimes want to wake up someone, especially when you know deep sleep is about to run out and you want to apply it again. That's where Erik's abilities are at their best. That's only when bosses sleep, which a few don't, and in Act 1 you don't have access to the Dirge of the Unlimited power to put everybody to sleep. So on those you want to use Poison, which basically means you're using 2 actions to get it one big hit. And if it doesn't do enough damage to justify putting 2 actions into it, then it's obviously bad. The best thing about it is that you can split those 2 actions among him and the other character that uses dagger, Sylvando, who unlike Erik has an actual strength stat, does way more damage and can even get Victimizer at base level. If you're using the 2 in combination, then Erik is going to be the one setting up for Sylvando in basically every case. And honestly, this is not half bad. Poison still has its limits because you obviously need to hit it, which isn't a 100% chance, it's pretty low early on. Against most bosses on average you're going to need at least 3 actions to get that one big hit, and instead you could have just been using the luminary with cutting edge or even unbridled blade to do either 2 times times 3 or 3 times times 3 damage. And that's with the significantly higher attack stat that a greatsword hero is going to have. A problem that he indirectly faces is that Sylvando needs to be the one to cash in the big hit. If Erik is the one to do it himself, because Sylvando is for example using Hustle Dance to heal your party, which we'll get to later, then the indirect damage output that Erik gets from applying poison gets significantly lower. It's honestly to the point where it's not worth doing anymore. In a lot of cases, Persecutor or Victimizer with the 6 times damage does less damage than a basic attack from the hero, not even cutting edge or unbridled blade. And often, even if you use Zap to reduce the enemy defense, the hero still does more than half the damage that the big hit does with a single unbridled blade. In essence, using these moves with Erik in Act 1 is not a viable form of damage. Early on he contributes, but that's because nobody else around. He gets outshined by Jade, the Luminary and Sylvando in terms of pure damage. Theoretically, the gap in weapon attack would grow smaller as long as you keep grinding for more and more levels, but even if you're hitting level 30 in the middle of Act 1, which isn't happening, let's be honest, the hero still outdamages him on an action to action basis. With the way the damage formula works out, he requires you to reduce enemy defense or else his damage, regardless of the multiplier, is going to be worthless. And for that, it doesn't help that you reliably outspeed the 2 characters that can reduce enemy defense in Act 1. And even being so specific, being unreliable because you need status effects to hit, and requiring Zap, he still doesn't outperform the other characters. So why do people like this so much? I think it comes down to 3 things. One is obviously that you like to see a single big number on screen doing that one big attack you get off. But there's 2 more things he gets later on. One is the ability called Divide, which triples his damage for a single action, which does count as a buff and can be removed. It will wear off if you don't attack on that turn, but in practice it gives him a 1.5 times damage multiplier to everything except the combo, where he can boost only the big hit to get an 18 times multiplier with 3 actions theoretically. That's over 6 times damage per action, which is the best multiplier you can get in the game. Of course, only if the poison sticks on the first attempt. If you want to get Divide along with one of the 6 times damage moves, utilizing Sleep you need to reach at least level 27 unless you're using skill seeds. And if you want to poison one, which is the only one useful against the last few bosses in Act 1, well, you need to reach level 29. At most he's going to be using this combo for 1 or 2 fights, but most likely he won't be using it at all during Act 1. You can beat the act much earlier, and honestly if you're going to those high levels, Erik is not going to be the most impressive party member, because you get so many other insanely strong options on the other characters if you're willing to grind so far. It doesn't matter how high his multipliers get, because for now his base damage is too low to do anything significant. Which is also why in my opinion dual wielding is trash, another thing that often gets praised. During Act 1 it only adds 1 point of damage for any weapon, any ability you use against any enemy. It's really pathetic. And what I need to mention now is probably that all draconian quests make Erik extremely worse. Without armor he can't use gear that increases his attack like accessories, which usually have a bigger impact on him because of his high multipliers than on other characters. The Divide wears off after one action, so if you get hit with a Shybox you just lose out, which not only decreases the value of the combo but decreases the value of all other abilities he has available to him. And the stronger enemy's draconian quest increases enemy defense, which means the slow base damage harms him even more. So what I recommend to newer players is that you don't use him for damage. Maybe use the sigils from time to time, they're not actually that bad. But Erik, despite not doing high damage, is pretty good early on. He can take a hit better than the other characters, at least his sisters early on, and he can outspeed things. Stock up his inventory with magic water, herbs, sleeping hibiscus. Bulk and agility are the only things that matter if you're an item bot, but even beyond that he has a couple of niches, like he can mass cure allies of sleep, which is occasionally game changing, although none of the Act 1 bosses try to put you to sleep. The only draconian quest that makes Erik seem more useful is the no shopping one, because he has the ability to steal stuff and unlocks the Hallelujah pep power, which gets you guaranteed rare drops from all enemies. They aren't useful in the middle of a boss fight, but allows you to still farm strong medicine, for example, without hating your life. Erik gets 10 bonus skill points in the middle of Act 1, which no other character besides Sylvando gets, and even if his damage options aren't great, he still has all those skill points to do something with, so what should you do? If you're playing on harder enemies and maybe even no armor, so you don't have many ways to manipulate turn order, getting his plus 10 and plus 30 agility is a huge blessing. It makes him the only character that can reliably outspeed some of the bosses without being pepped up. Then the weapon choices are all about equal, but none of them are really good. I talked about how his high multipliers don't really help him when the base damage is low, and none of his weapons really fix that low base damage. Boomerangs have the highest multiplier at 2.4 times with Boomerang, then Falcon Slash with the 2 times multipliers right behind. The highest damage he can actually output, besides with sigils, is sometimes Cobra Strike without activating the combo and just poisoning the enemy and letting it sit. Of course you don't do the damage immediately, but if you let it sit over the course of all the turns that the enemy is envenomated, sometimes it even out damages Sylvando. Though maybe not on average, because poison doesn't always stick. So what I recommend is getting the agility and then afterwards Cobra Strike maybe, but it honestly doesn't matter too much. And I guess Metal Clicker can be used against early game metal slimes, but it's not good. Something Erik does just as well as everybody else is activating pep powers. Earlier with the hero I explained how going first is sometimes not optimal, but especially when you only have 4 party members available to you and aren't messing around with the lineup, going first is honestly best. And in those cases, Erik is the party member whose action you need the least, so losing it and instead replacing it with a pep power is going to give you the greatest benefit. There are specifically 4 pep powers in Act 1 that I think are worth mentioning. The first you unlock at level 10, which is called Scorched Earth. It only involves him being pepped, making it something you can sometimes just get in the middle of a fight. It annihilates early fights up until and including Jarvis. Every fight that early on that Erik is level 10 will just get solved by having it. It's a damage over time that will scale to get stronger, but the lowest power is still strong enough to solo fights early on. It also lowers enemy fire resistance, which can come into play in some fancy strategies. The second and third I'd like to mention are also sigil powers. Thunder and Lightning does a lot of damage early on. It requires 3 party members, him, the Luminary and Veronica, to be pepped up, covers different elements than the fire sigil, but most importantly it does a good chunk more damage. Maybe around 600 in total, depending on elemental resistances and so on. It also scales, but doesn't scale well, and just like the others, it's going to fall off later on. But early on it is the best per action damage you're gonna get with anything. Then once Web gets available you unlock Fire and Brimstone, which is the same as Thunder and Lightning, except It does a little bit more damage and it has different elements. It comes so late though that by that point you have better damage options. Finally, the last pep worth mentioning is Wild Side. It's a buff to Erik that does so much. It allows him to act twice. Sadly, if he's the one to activate it, he won't get the second turn immediately. It also buffs his agility and notably his attack. There are not many attack buffs early on, so this is quite unique. It takes Serena, the Luminary and Erik to be pepped up and is always unlocked. You would much rather give this buff to anyone else, but he's the only one that gets it. It means that sometimes you still want to use him for damage, despite me explaining for quite a while now that his damage output is really bad. Though you of course need to reduce the enemy's defense and or fight an enemy that already has low defense to begin with. So from all this it might seem like I really don't like Erik, but I still use him a lot in Act 1, just not as a main attacker. Once we get to the expanded skill trees though, he improves quite a bit. Next is Veronica. Well, Zap is pretty good. Her agility is about the same as Sylvando or the hero. Means that she has a shot to outspeed with equipment, but without she's struggling. That's a shame because her durability sucks, and while it stops mattering in postgame, here in Act 1 it hurts her quite a bit. It's totally possible that you have a strategy in mind where she uses Zap, but then the boss outspeeds and kills her with a regular attack combined with some AoE. And with Draconian quests, sometimes the regular attack just one-shots her outright. And with armor, it's obviously way easier to get that one zap off. Even if she dies after outspeeding an enemy, it doesn't matter anymore because she's already applied the debuff and you aren't losing an action with her dying. Though while zap is really great, it isn't the only thing she has. She has a vast array of spells. Most of them aren't that great, for example the damaging ones, with maybe the exception of Sizzle, which is good even against single targets early on and can't be parried. The stretch between Jasper and the Slayer of the Sands comes to mind. Frizzle is decent, but by that point the 80-ish damage you deal isn't worth it. Magic Barrier is surprisingly bad. Not a lot of enemies use spells, and the ones that do don't do so frequently enough for the buff to matter. Fizzle sucks for the same reason. And even if we look beyond Act 1, you get Bounce, and at that point you aren't going to waste an action on Magic Barrier if you could instead prevent the boss from using spells entirely. Bounce is really strong in this game. It not only doesn't reflect your own spells, but the enemy AI acts like it's being hit by Fizzle in some cases. The only spells you aren't preventing are single target or self-targeting. Sadly, Bounce isn't around for long in Act 1, you only get it at level 27. And it's sadly unreasonable to get some of the more useful skills like Umfl at level 31 or Blunt at level 36. If you do happen to hit level 31 though, Umfl is going to make the rest of Act 1 a cakewalk. Something you can do is drain enemy magic, and against some bosses it actually works to drain them to 0 MP. The requirement for that is that Veronica survives though. And in a lot of cases you could have killed them before you drained their MP either way, so I don't recommend actually doing it. She also gets Fuddle as a bit of a bonus, but in most cases you would rather apply Sleep. That's because enemy confusion resistances are much higher. But among the sea of very niche spells, there's one that I think people often overlook. As I've shown in the video on this game's combat system, if you reliably outspeed an enemy, you can kill them. Even if they negate all buffs, insta-wipe your party and had a million HP. That being said, Deceleratal isn't an instant win button. The agility debuff wears off quickly because bosses tend to act often per turn. And a lot of the bosses are so fast that without equipment to boost you, it still doesn't allow you to go first reliably, even if the debuff sticks. Acceleratal is way more reliable, it doesn't require you to roll for the hit, and it lasts longer. But all that aside, if Veronica is going to die when the boss acts the next time anyways, getting the slow and going before him again on the next turn means you didn't waste an action at all. And everybody else who happens to go first is just a bonus afterwards. And Veronica might even be able to save her own life that way, because maybe somebody else who outspeeds can apply a debuff, a status effect, or even kill the boss outright. It can be absolutely clutch in some fights. But of course against slow bosses where all your party members already outspeed, it's not useful at all. But again, it can sometimes be useful, and it's definitely an underused spell. I blame it on people not knowing how the turns work in this game. So now that we've talked about the learn spells, let's go on to the underwhelming skill tree. So whips out of the way, they don't have a single good thing about them yet. The abilities are all either super low chance for status effect and you could just use Sleeping Hibiscus, or even Fuddle, and doing damage in any other way would be way more productive. Using status effects any other way would be way more productive, and spending 2 turns on doing both is going to have a way better outcome than using a whip ability twice. Twin Dragon Lash, the ability in the middle that you probably won't even reach, has a 2x damage multiplier and hits twice, meaning it's a 4x damage multiplier, but Veronica's attack stat is so incredibly low that it doesn't matter. It could be a 10x damage multiplier and she still wouldn't do more damage than any of the characters that you actually want to use for damage. If you do happen to go with whips, they're terrible, but you're actually not losing out on much because the other abilities on her skill tree are just as bad. Heavy Wands slightly increase your spell damage through higher magical might, but it's not very important, and the abilities you learn are very mid. Anti-magic is a single target fizzle. Zephyr Salvation is only slightly better than throwing a strong herb. Ring of Ruin sucks because spells only do double damage with crits, and the chance to crit is a measly 20%, so you could just use another spell. And Will to Freeze is never gonna do more than like 1 damage, and Coagulant is Bible and has a way better chance for paralysis. And with that we can already move on to the bottom tree, which is small passive buffs, but that's better than the other trees honestly. It should go without saying that no matter what skill tree you're putting points in, even if you're going for full whips build, if you do ever want to still use a spell for damage, you would just swap to a Great Wand to increase your damage for that turn. Given how bad whip abilities are for her and how neither of the weapon types gives her passive benefits, I think in most cases you're just going to hold on to one Great Wand and chill. So I almost forgot to mention the abilities on the bottom tree, which are not worth mentioning. They are Spooky Hour and Channel Anger. The first makes enemies weaker to spells, the second increases her spell damage. Honestly, even if she permanently had Channel Anger on her, spell damage using her still wouldn't be as good as other sources of damage. But at least the abilities that do something. Then taking 20% less elemental damage might seem nice, but in most cases 1-shots are still gonna be 1-shots. And the 2-shots are still gonna be 2-shots, guess what? But it is possible that it eventually will make a difference, and just that is still more value than literally nothing else. So what I'm getting at is that all of that right now could have been shortened to her skill tree doesn't matter. Her pet powers with the exception of Thunder and Lightning are just as unremarkable. In general, using her against something she doesn't reliably outspeed is always a risk because she can get killed before doing anything, in which case you lose out on the action she had coming up. Zap really makes the risk worth it though, and in 90% of the fights she's only going to be using Zap once and then she's leaving. By which I mean that she dies and then you swap out for an alive party member. Serena is very slow and not much tankier than her sister, which makes her hard to use. Her healing spells are fine, they heal more than herbs, but if you don't need to heal more than a strong herb, then obviously there's no benefit to using her for it. One of her more useful abilities is Dazzle, which has niche uses like against the Slayer of the Sands, and Kabuff or eventually Kabuff. Buffing your defense is very powerful if you have armor. Without it does nothing. Later on, when you want to damage things with spells, Anathematize can be used, kinda like Veronica's Spooky Hour. But right now it's pretty much useless, and there's a lot more abilities like that Serena has. For example, her best damage option right now is Swoosh, which is worst in using items. If she reaches level 28, Swoosh is going to outdamage them, but for example the Shiver Stick is just better than trying to damage any other way with her. The Insect spell is actually kinda justified in some cases. but it doesn't work against any of the bosses. She also has Fizzle like her sister, she has Zing and Squelch, which are all completely useless, at least in battle. That leaves Accelerate and Acceleratal for more learnable spells, which are good for the reasons I listed earlier with Veronica. Sadly, the increase isn't as high as you'd want it to be, and if you for example buff the hero Sylvando or Veronica speed, they won't necessarily outspeed something. It of course depends on what you're fighting, and in some cases you just aren't going to outspeed something no matter how hard you try. In practice, this is like passing your action on to another party member. She uses her and then the other party member gets an extra turn before the boss acts. And Accelerate is only for reliability in most cases, but if even one person outspeeds, it's already worth casting. Onto the skill trees. Just like with her sister, she functions almost the same without them. Harps, for example, are the worst skill tree in the entire game. The hymns decrease damage taken from a single element by 20%. It doesn't stack with other resistances, it's just that the damage you take is multiplied by 0.8 at the very end of the calculation. Now 20% as a passive bonus like Veronica got it from skill tree, that would be good, but you're wasting an action for it. Not even against Crystallinda, who primarily uses ice attacks. Not even she uses so many of them that the 20% bonus is gonna add up over all the hits that you take. And harps don't carry over to party members that aren't swapped in, obviously. Maybe if it was like a global buff to everybody, even after you swap them out, it would have a bit more value, but as they are right now, they're useless in every situation. You should never touch them. One of her alternatives is Spears, which is currently pretty bad. You can sometimes reallocate to it for crit moves for metal farming, but right now she doesn't have any actual combat abilities. Having an option to kill metal slimes is really helpful. It is, however, at a very late level, so you won't be using it on regular metal slimes, and while it is useful against liquid metal slimes, that is not something you do a lot in Act 1. This is always going to be after you get Web and Jade to join you, but while she doesn't bring anything new to the table with this, you should still use her spears for grinding, even if you have Jade who's better, because you can use both. And lastly, Wands, which is the canon choice. That's not because they're very good, because magical manning, for example, really doesn't matter when you're already healing to full, which she does. The stat boosts really don't matter, neither does the MP absorption or whatever. But she does get two abilities from it, which are kinda useful. The most important part of the tree is Snap Crackle Proof, which makes one of your party members immune to status effects for a few turns. It's especially useful in no armor, because there's no other way to really protect yourself from status effects. Alma Mater is also pretty good, because it allows you to protect, for example, Veronica from being one-shot. If it allows Veronica, for example, to not die and not lose out on her action, it's already neutral. And in that sense, it's much better than reviving with Kazing after somebody dies. And lastly, I'd like to mention dual wielding, because right now it's really bad. Right now there's no wand with a passive ability that's strong enough to make you want to use it over a shield, and there's none that have an ability that procs at the start of battle. So lastly we get to the peps, and we've only mentioned Wildside up until now, which is very good, but there's 3 more I like. The Care Prayer pep power is decent. It's like using 2 buffs, and it only requires her and the hero to be pepped up. With armor it's extremely powerful, but again without it does nothing. Next up we have Brownie Boost, which you use alongside Jade and the hero. It boosts your attack, which is very hard to come by in Act 1. The other effects are just a bit of a bonus. And then finally we have Saint's Ascension. The pep power allows you to later on use an ability that revives and heals everybody. Well, everybody in your active lineup. But because Serena usually goes last, she can comfortably swap in everybody who wants to heal. At first glance it might seem useless, because it takes 2 action to get a glorified Hustle Dance, 1 to enable the ability and 1 to actually activate the ability. But it's much better than that. The ability stays enabled between fights and can't be removed by anything but death. Even disruptive waves don't remove the ability. You can get the 3 party members pepped, activate the pep, unlock the ability and then get them pepped again before you ever enter a boss fight. The 3 party members involved being the Luminary, Serena and Web. If you're really struggling on a boss fight, this is always something you can do to give yourself a little boost. Saint's Song makes her much better if you're trying to get past something you're really stuck on. And outside of that, her actions by themselves, they don't do much. She's a true support in the sense that she can prevent other party members from losing out on their actions, either through death or through status effects. Her bulk is better than Veronica's, but she still gets killed super quickly, and coupled with her terrible agility, it means that she can often die before getting a single action in, and a single target heal isn't a huge payoff by itself. Another annoying thing is that she will usually go last or maybe second to last if you have grab, but once she is in your active lineup before a new turn, you can't swap her out without losing an action. It really hurts because you're either wasting an action to swap her out before she gets hers, or she stays in and has a bad action every turn. If you can avoid using her, it's usually for the better. Though of course you want to use every party member you have available, and even if she's the worst one here, she still has a lot of uses, and especially with Saint's Song, after losing everybody else in your party, she can sometimes get you a comeback.
Geronimo!
Sylvando is definitely the best character here, even in terms of gameplay. He has great survivability, especially compared to Erik and the sisters, the three last characters we talked about. And as mentioned with the hero, him going middle of the pack gives him a lot of flexibility. And while it hurts him that he can't outspeed most bosses, he has even more flexibility over turn order because he gets plus 20 agility from his skill tree. With it, his agility will only be slightly lower than Jade's. Without, the hero has a good shot of outspeeding him. And if you have the plus 10 agility on the luminary from the skill tree, his agility will be almost the same as Sylvando's with the plus 20. The super exact numbers don't matter because of the RNG, but he, along with Veronica and the luminary, is the only one who will reliably be able to be slower than Jade and Erik, but still outspeed Serena and well. Keep in mind this is only useful because Sylvando has access to so many support abilities, which we'll go over in a second. Because while I did mention the plus 20 agility you can get from his skill tree, I don't recommend it. There's way better use of his skill points until you have some to spare. As soon as he joins, you can reallocate twice to go down the left part of the skill tree and get plus 10 skill points. You can reallocate twice again and either get Victimizer or Hustle Dance right off the bat. Hustle Dance is like using mid-heal on every party member. I hope I don't have to explain how good it is when your second best heals come from mid-heal. And at this point of the game, Serena mightn't even have learned it. She learns it at level 16 and Sylvando joins at level 15. The luminary even needs to go all the way to level 19. The MP cost barely matters because you get so much magic water before every boss fight. And honestly, I still prefer using a magic water and then getting 2 hustle dances to using 4 mid heals. And of course that's only once you start running out of MP and he has a starting amount. On the other hand, if you decide to take Victimizer, he starts doing more damage than the hero. And given how Erik's alternatives to using Cobra Strike to set up Sylvando are so bad at this point, you're not losing out on much to set it up. As mentioned before, his attack is way higher than Erik's. I can only really recommend it for a fight where Erik isn't present, so the fight against Jasper though. And even then, only if your party members are getting one shot, because otherwise Hustle Dance is just too strong to miss out on. Then later on at level 25 or level 24 with 3 skill seeds, if you're playing with them of course, you can get the Gold Rush ability. An upside is that to unlock Gold Rush you need Hustle Dance available, so you still have that option to fall back on. But Gold Rush is by far the best damage option in Act 1, unless you're very over leveled. And it's quite a simple ability. You pay 1000 gold and do 300 damage to every enemy. No boss resists it and stats don't matter when Sylvando starts throwing the cash. The cost might seem very high, but it's much more efficient than buying weapons. And the game's economy isn't very strict either way. Especially if you're playing with draconian quests like no armor or no shopping. I really highly recommend it. Just try throwing cash and you never want to go back. Even this early on, 1000 gold is not much. For example, Crystalinda dies in 6 gold rushes and drops 7000 gold. Tentacular dies in 5, 4 if you've used the cannon and drops 4000. It's possible to beat Act 1 before reaching level 25, but when compared to the other level benchmarks your party members need, level 25 is very low and it just wins Act 1. I'm honestly so addicted that I even use it instead of fleeing, because it's so much faster to just win the battle really quickly, lose maybe 500 through 750 gold in the process, because you earn some back, and a gold rush doesn't even cost MP. If you want to conserve money and use him for hustle dances while everybody else is doing damage and he happens to run out of MP, instead of throwing magic water at him, you can instead start throwing cash. If you take anything away from this video, it should be that Gold Rush is pretty strong in Act 1. But there is still way more to his skill tree. Unlike Erik, he can get nastier knives, the better chance to poison or sleep enemies with dagger skills, even in Act 1. He could also use whips, and while just like with Veronica, most of his abilities are trash, he gets Worm Whip. It's an ability with a 180% multiplier, which isn't great, but it removes buffs. Right now the only buffs he can remove are, for example, peps on some bosses, but there's going to be more later on. But surprisingly, even with whips he doesn't suck. With swords he sadly won't do much damage, so just like with whips, I don't really recommend going into that skill tree. At the end of the day, as long as he's wielding a shield, the weapon he's holding onto doesn't matter too much while he's tossing his coins. In my opinion, you should be using either Hustle Dance or the knife moves. And then once you can afford it, go straight for Gold Rush and never look back. There still are a few honorable mentions. For example, he has the Omni status heal and Sobering Slap, which might still be worth going for once you have Gold Rush already, or if you can get it alongside Hustle Dance before you can afford Gold Rush. Puddle Dance can be good sometimes, as it's the only AoE status effect you have available, and you have to get it on your way to Gold Rush. He also has an ability that's great for metal farming in Have a Ball. It's 3 times normal damage spread out in a bunch of small hits. If Gold Rush didn't exist, this would actually be his best damage option. But against metal enemies, each of the smaller 6 hits has a small to deal damage. Bonus damage against metal enemies, for example from a metal sword, will actually apply to every single one of these hits, so later on this is still gonna be useful. Again, this is only relevant at the very end of Act 1 if you have to grind up levels in order to prepare for the start of Act 2, but it's worth mentioning. But it doesn't end here. Sylvando gets a lot of spells from levels and they're not half bad. Well, with 2 exceptions in Rouge and Reheal. Reheal on the guy with Hustle Dance is just trash, and Rouge is trash if you consider how much attack he has. But besides those, he has both Accelerate and Decelerate, which are occasionally useful. He can cure paralysis and sleep on the party, although curing 3 people of paralysis is sometimes not worth not tossing cash that turn. That's because you're only gonna get paralyzed in regular battles, and most regular enemies don't have 300 HP. None of the bosses in Act 1 use status effects besides turn skip, beguilement and confusion. It's good though that he has all these options, and it makes him even more valuable. Then Sylvando just so happens to be the only party member that has Oomph, and unless Veronica gets Oomph at level 31, that's the only way to boost your attack power without peps. And speaking of which, he along with the hero triggers the Fighting Fantastic pep power. I don't need to explain how buffing everybody's attack by 50% is a huge bonus. If you can make him go before the hero will even get an attack on the same turn. It's a great start for any battle you're stuck on, one of the best pep powers early on. The Love Hurts pep power is sometimes misrepresented. It doesn't always paralyze an enemy that isn't immune. I don't know where that comes from and why it's on basically every wiki entry, but it's nowhere near as good as, for example, Dirge of Dandrasil. So let's kill the myth now. Then there's Shooting Star. I bet you can find a use for it, but I never bothered. It definitely has some application somewhere. And then there's Electrolyte, which is good for farming. I talk about it more in the video on common misconceptions. It doesn't matter for boss fights, and Jade is always the one to activate it, because the enemies don't immediately get an action on the turn you activate it on. So obviously whoever goes first on that turn wants to be the one activating it. Once he unlocks Gold Rush though, it's not like Sylvando wants to ever activate a pep again. given how his damage, his healing of both HP and status effects are all the best you have until Act 2. So next up we have two characters joining at the same time again, and I'm going to cover Jade first. She joins pretty late, but once she does, she's gonna be your best damage dealer until Sylvando gets Gold Rush or the Luminary gets some Vital Blade. That's because she can get multi-thrust immediately and start doing 3 times damage with pretty high attack. She also has Thunder and Lightning Thrust for metal farming, and that's it. All her other abilities in Act 1 are for damage and less damage than multi-thrust, or they're trading one of her actions with one of her regular enemy and none of the bosses. Puff Puff and Leg Sweep both are never worth it, because she could just kill an enemy outright, at least regular enemies, and the boss are all immune. Sexy Beam is pretty strong if you have no weapon or the enemy has really high defense, but there's no fight in practice where the damage is multi-thrust, even if your pep, which doubles her charm. Some of the flat stat boosts and the pepper power panel are worth getting on a skill tree, but only one she has points to spare. She should just be spamming multi-thrust, maybe activating peps, maybe using items where needed. In all honesty, she would even be useful if her attack stat was garbage and she didn't have multi-thrust. She is really bulky, and while not quite as fast as Erik normally, when pepped up she doubles her agility or goes up to 250% if you have the pepper power thing. It makes her outspeed almost everything reliably, and the only person to do so, which has many applications. Especially later on, she gets access to so many plays like Yggdraken's Blessing before the enemy gets to act, but for now she just hits things and her damage is the best for a short while, against Tentacular and Doa and Grey. There is technically one application for claws, which is the Crystallina fight. She summons a snowstorm that reduces your accuracy, but the Hawkeye Claw ability will always hit despite that. Because claws have lower damage and the snowstorm isn't always up, and because Hawkeye Claw doesn't have a good damage multiplier, multi-thrust just outdamages it on average though, even in the snowstorm. Absorbing a nothing amount of HP doesn't justify using claws either. The spears you get also just happen to be way better than the claws. The trident you can buy right away carries you throughout the game, but if you go to the casino, the lightning lance is incredibly strong. Almost nothing resists lightning and most enemies are even weak to it. Then the attack stat is also just high and it gives you agility. If you don't get it, because you don't bother with the casino, you can still get a lightning lance or the recipe and the ingredients required to forge it in the dungeon leading up to the Elysium bird. This is her peak output now and you should make use of it. Something I will address right now is that crit builds don't work. There's not many ways to stack the crit chance now, but it never gets high enough. None of her moves have a great chance by now, and spears with normal hits sometimes do more damage than crits with claws. At least when you're comparing, for example, her strongest claw ability, Hard Claw, with a single crit, against a multi-thrust where none of the hits crit. At least if you're using Zap, without it might look a bit different. But again, it's not like any of the claw moves have a critical multiplier that's worth going for. Most of them are just 0.5. One thing you sometimes want to do instead of spamming multi-thrust is using pep powers, and she has a couple of good ones. The Brownie Boost pep power is good obviously, she goes first because of her high agility so everyone else can make use of the buffs immediately. Worrying Tirade is also fine, it trades her action 1-to-1 with all the enemies, but with most bosses only getting 2 actions per turn it ends up being worth it. At least against, for example, the Elysium bird where all enemies get stunned. It's a bit underrated but not a great move overall. So there's not much to say, she has high HP, high agility, really fast by a big margin when pepped, and her damage is good for a while. She's simple and efficient. The last character we can talk about for Act 1 is Web, who is not as impressive as Jade, but he has tons of abilities to work with. He's tied with Serena for slowest, and even his bonus agility from the skill tree won't change that. I recommend not getting it because going last reliably at least makes planning a bit easier. Also, unlike Serena and Veronica, he has at least a bit of HP to work with. The thing he's probably most used for in Act 1 is being a second zap user. So in case Veronica fails to hit or if she dies before action comes up, you can still have Web as a plan B. honestly a more reliable one given how he survives most single attacks. Other than that, his damage spells are less than optimal sadly. Zam is impressive for a first tier spell, dealing around 60 damage to some enemies, but by the time Web joins you it's much too late for that. He really doesn't want to be the one doing damage. Technically he has a good chance of quitting with the Zam spells, but it's only 2 times damage if he does quit, and to top it off the higher chance only means a 2 times multiplier of whatever he already has, which isn't much. And on the same note, just like with Jade, going for criticals with his claw abilities isn't worth it. The crit chances never get high enough to actually deal a significant amount of damage. And in my opinion, if you're finding yourself in a situation where you need Web to do damage, you messed up somewhere along the way. His healing is also not great, at least not as great as Sylvando's. He probably won't reach multi-heal at level 30, and if he does, it's only at the very end of the act. At least it's much faster than Serena's level 35, but at most you'll still only have it for maybe 1 or so fights. What he does get is more heal at level 24, which is just 1 level past his joining level, and it makes him a much better healer than Serena for a while. Overall, he doesn't bring much new to the table, except Insulate. It's a buff that nobody else can apply, but it's also really bad because it's too specific. None of the bosses spam breath attacks in such an amount that making one party member more resistant to them justifies wasting an action. He can cure confusion, poison and blindness, the latter 2 of which are pretty bad things to cure with one of your actions, but of course past the point where he joins, none of the bosses use any of the listed status effects. Well, he does have Whack, which is still alright for random encounters you run into, but again, at most you can take out an ad in the Elysium bird fight. Having bounce immediately is good, at least depending on the playthrough. I don't like it on low armor because making bosses use more auto attacks against you is actually a death sentence, but it can be useful in the Crystallina fight, for example, to prevent crackles. Snooze and Dazzle are neat options, but Dazzle peaked in the Slayer of the Sands fight honestly, and Sleeping Hibiscus still outclasses Snooze. By the time he joins, a lot of the abilities have become irrelevant, the last of which is Drain Magic, which just doesn't see any application. And just like the other casters, he also doesn't have an impactful skill tree. The bonuses from the Great Wands is negligible, and Claws aren't a good damage option. And his top path also doesn't offer anything worth using either. Zing Stick from the Heavy Wands tree is the only reliable revive outside of Yggdrasil leaves this early on. Yggdrasil leaves can easily be obtained from the casino, but if you decide to play without, then it has some value. Going Great Wands also increases damage, or less notable, his healing with spells slightly. The healing is usually overkill and he rarely wants to use spells for damage, so the bonuses again don't matter. Lastly, Claws give you a slight dodge chance, and I think they're funny, so that's what I usually go with, but honestly even going for the top path is fine. White as Rain is probably the most useful ability of the bunch. It's like a glorified reheal, and well, reheal is pretty bad, so I still don't recommend it in good faith. Just do whatever and you're gonna be fine. Lastly, I want to mention that I already mentioned all of his pet powers. All the ones that Owen Fire and Grimstone or Saint's Ascension aren't that good. Web really peaks later on, which is unusual for older characters in video games. He's still useful now, and I'd argue he's more useful than either of the sisters when you're not using Saint Song with Serena, but being the 3rd worst character by the time he joins is not very impressive. I'm really looking forward to talking about how busted Dirge of Dunvasil is gonna be once he gets it, but for now that's all. Act 1 really does end abruptly, and the way the party members play and when they're available changes, either not at all or drastically depending on who we are talking about. That's where the next part is going to be about each character's performance in Act 2.